Welcome back, everyone. Today I'm going to show you how I made these post-apocalyptic sunken city dioramas. I originally got the idea for these dioramas from the YouTube channel Tested. They had taken some work from a Japanese modeler and tried to duplicate it, in which they take a little model cityscape and pour it in resin and do some weathering effects on it to get this nice, cool little scene here. And so I thought that these would make cool little stocking stuffers, something for my relatives to put on their desks, and they also seem to be a pretty easy, straightforward diorama. So I'm going to follow pretty closely to what they did on the Tested video, except I'm going to really push the weathering and also the foliage effects. They went pretty simplistic with that, and I felt I could do a little bit better of a job. So sit back and hopefully I can show you a quick and easy diorama that you could maybe duplicate if you're wanting to start getting into the world of dioramas, as it can be a very time-consuming and sometimes stressful area of our hobby, but it's always rewarding when you're able to pull off that museum quality piece that you can put in your display cabinet. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start on our diorama. So first things first, I'm going to take my little skyscrapers here and I'm going to weather them pretty heavily, as you see here. It's a little bit different than what you saw in the Tested video. I'm going for, buildings that have been submerged for decades and are falling apart. So to create my weathering, I'm going to use just a simple hand drill, here a little hand saw, and also, of course, a hobby knife to do a lot of the legwork. So we'll just take these nice skyscraper models. These are from HobbyLink Japan. They are the GeoCraper brand, and they are really heavily detailed models, and they're not too expensive. They're about $5 or $6 for a set of, you get about 4 to 8 buildings within each little, block. And shipping isn't too bad. You just, have to wait a few from Japan. So when I weather these, I start off and I just take my hobby knife and I'm going to just scrape at the edges, create divots on the model, like blown out glass and parts of the building that I've chipped away. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get my hand drill out and I'm going to use that to drill holes of differing sizes into the buildings. Like again, the windows have blown out or a piece of debris has knocked out a section of the skyscraper. And I noticed in the Tested video that they had lots of air bubbles coming out of their resin, and it looked like it was because they were escaping from the buildings. So I made sure all of my buildings at least had a little drill hole in it to make sure I wouldn't get any trapped air that would release while the resin was setting. And then for really extreme weathering, I'd go and I'd take my hobby saw and just kind of go into the sides of the buildings again, as if over the decades of being submerged and having debris smash into the buildings, waves and whatnot, that, these things were heavily damaged. So just go in there, saw out pieces, and I also keep a piece of white paper behind my model, and I'm catching and collecting all of the pieces of plastic that I'm cutting off here with my drill and with my saw and my hobby knife. And I'm going to use that to place around my building as if it's fallen debris that has come off the buildings after years and years of neglect. And I'm also going to take my saw here and make some weathering effects by just running it diagonally, horizontally against the building, giving some scarring marks. I even like to tear up the tops of the skyscrapers with the saw to again make it look very derelict, as if the thing is barely standing. And once I'm done with all my weathering effects, I'm going to go and I'm going to spray the buildings down with some watered down PVA. And then I'm going to take all those little bits and pieces of plastic that I collected as I was cutting and sawing and marking up my buildings. I'm going to take all the plastic that came off of them, and I'm going to place it around the base or on ledges on the buildings, places where I think debris would collect. Again, to make these buildings look very dilapidated. We are going for an I Am Legend dilapidated look to our skyscrapers. And then after that dried, I went and I sprayed it, primed it black, and I'm going to go ahead and do a little zenithal highlight so that still be a nice contrast in our buildings, and it will help the washes really pull the details out of our buildings. So I'm taking here just a mid-tone gray and I'm spraying it at about, a 45-degree angle, making sure that some of that black primer kind of shows through, but gives a nice easy highlight on all my skyscrapers. And then as a high highlight, I'm going to take pure white and spray it straight down on top of it at about a 90-degree angle, only hitting the highest points. And that will be a good base for all the washes and weathering effects we're going to put on our buildings. So the first wash I'm going to do is I'm going to use Vallejo Streaking Grime here. It's this nice kind of dingy green color. That's the color scale I'm going to go for, is some greens and yellows, like moss and vegetation has been growing on these sunken buildings for a long time. So I'm just applying here a 50-50 mixture of the Vallejo Streaking Grime and water. It's pretty transparent. You only get this subtle green tint to our buildings. And then for some heavier grime, I'm going to be using a bunch of artist inks. I'm going to use this kind of dark green-brown color, and then this greenish yellow color, and I'm going to mix them together to give us some nice weathering, as if there's moss or vegetation or just mold growing all over our buildings. So I'll start with my dark wash. I'm just applying it in a stippling manner over random places on my buildings. I'm trying to not go too heavy with this ink, and as you can see, I watered it down quite a bit so that those highlights and lowlights that we created with our priming are still showing through. But I'm going through areas that I think would be picking up the most amount of dirt around any holes that I've punched through the buildings, or any areas that I've cut out, places where I think that just dingy moss and mold would collect. And then I'm going around those dark areas and I'm applying that greenish yellow ink that has also been heavily watered down. You don't want it to be too strong. You want your priming to show through. And I'm taking that ink and I'm hitting around all those really dark brown places we just placed. All right, kind of blending them into one another. The original layer is still kind of wet, so I'm stippling it in there. And so to blend these inks into the building itself, I'm going back with that Vallejo Streaking Grime. This is nearly undiluted now, and I'm covering most of the buildings. I'm leaving kind of the top portions untouched by the second layer of the streaking grime. The idea is they're going to be out of the water, so they're probably not as dingy and moldy as what is sitting beneath. And now to add a little color pop to my diorama, I'm going to take some pigments by Secret Weapon Miniatures. They're rust pigments, and I'm just going to place them in areas where I think rust would be collecting, mostly in those areas that I've punched out of the buildings, as if water has collected up there and there's just kind of this stream of rust coming out of the buildings. Might not be all that realistic, but I think it looks cool, and especially when we put the foliage on there, it'll be nice to have some reds and browns popping out from the greens that will be covering the buildings here momentarily. So I'm just taking it and I'm just dragging it downwards. And then once I'm done with the rust colors, I felt like I needed some darker browns in some of the crevices of the buildings. So I'm taking another pigment here. This is actually by Vallejo. This is their burnt umber color. And I'm taking the pigment and I'm just stippling it across the buildings, again in areas where I think it will be the dingiest. And with these pigments, you can either keep them on and then apply alcohol on them to set them, or if you want a really subtle effect, you can put the pigment on there since it's chalky, then blow it away and you only have a subtle hint of the pigment. So I kind of do a little bit of both, having it collect, and in places where I want only a soft hint of color, I'll apply the pigment and then blow it off the model. And then once I'm happy with my weathering, I'm going to apply my scenic glue to the diorama. This will help lock in the pigments, and also it will allow us to start applying flocks to the diorama. And the first flock that I'm going to add to this model is the Burnt Grass Fine Flock by Woodland Scenics. And I'm just sprinkling it all over the top, having it catch on all the ledges. It's a very nice yellow-green subtle color. It blends pretty well with the washes we put down on the buildings, and also has a nice texture too. So I'm just placing that everywhere. And then around the base of the buildings, I'm going to be placing the Blended Earth Fine Turf by Woodland Scenics. And this will do a great job of simulating the ocean floor, as it has a lot of browns and yellows in there to give a sandy look with maybe some vegetation there at the bottom of the seafloor. So again, I'm mostly making sure that hits around the base, not getting any of that at the top of my building. You have to be careful since it is covered in that scenic glue. And if you do get any flock anywhere you don't want it, just take an old brush, and just wipe away the flock from those areas and let it dry, and then we'll move on to adding some coarse flock to the buildings. So for our denser foliage on our buildings, we're going to be using this coarse flock by Woodland Scenics. It's a nice yellow-green color. And all I will do will place a little bit of Mod Podge onto the building and stick as much of this coarse turf on there as I can, using here a sculpting tool to really push it down into the sides of the building, into those little crevices, into the windows, to make it look like this vegetation is literally exploding out of the building. So I'm going to be focusing pretty heavily with this coarse flock on the areas that will be submerged underneath the resin to simulate, I don't know, kelp or some other sea plant life, but I'm also going to put it at the very top of the building. We're going to be placing trees at the top, so the coarse flock will kind of help hide where we're going to be gluing down those trees here in a moment. Alright, so to make our trees, we're going to be taking some seafoam material that often modelers use for making realistic trees and foliage, and we're going to be applying a little bit of PVA glue. And then I'm going to use this super leaf material from Scenic Express, dip in my little branch, my little seafoam branch in there, and here we go, we can make a quick and easy tree. And then as a final highlight for my trees, I put some of that yellow leaf material on the top of it, and then I'm just going to here super glue it to the top. I feel that for these small little branches, Mod Podge just can't do the job, or PVA glue can't do the job. You'll need super glue, so just put a little dab of super glue. You'll probably have to hold it in place for about 30 seconds, and then when you're done, you'll have yourself a nice tree. So after I place trees, as you can see, all across the top of my buildings, now we are getting ready for the resin portion, which is often the most stressful portion of any water diorama or build that you're going to have. And the most important thing when you're dealing with resin is having a good dam. And since we are pouring quite a bit of resin for this diorama, a few inches thick, I'm going to deviate from what I usually use to dam up resin, which is just Scotch tape. And I'm going to be using strips here of plastic art. And first I'll coat one side of it that's going to adhere to the diorama with some Mod Podge. When that dries, hopefully it will have a nice seal so that no resin will seep through it. Then to hold it in place while it's drying, I just put a nice bead of hot glue at the bottom and along the side. And this will also be our fail-safe. So if for whatever reason our Mod Podge doesn't hold and the resin starts leaking, it will at least be caught by the hot glue. So I always go overkill when damming. I've had lots of leaking issues, and it can really ruin all the hard work you've put into a diorama or model. And so I always suggest when you're dealing with resin, go the extra mile. Make sure your dam is impregnable, and you'll be happy about it later when you're not spending hours and hours trying to fix your diorama. So here again, putting the last section of my dam on, using the Mod Podge and the hot glue. And I'm going to let this set overnight, make sure all that Mod Podge is dry, and then we'll pour our resin. So here we go. I've already mixed up our Envirolite resin, and I've even mixed in a little bit of blue ink in there. And I'm going to be using here this little syringe to apply all the resin. I don't want any of it getting on my building, so this little syringe will allow me to be pretty accurate in where I place the resin. And so here I am actually placing some little aquatic animals that I've painted up that I got from a hobby store, just using some tweezers and placing them into the resin as I pour it. And when it dries, hopefully you'll be able to see some nice marine life swimming around our buildings. So here's a little cautionary tale for you. These were the first two dioramas that I made for my relatives, and I poured the resin in my garage when it was a little too cool, and so I got all these micro bubbles in the resin, and it made it so that the resin wasn't very clear. You couldn't see very far into it. You couldn't even see all these little marine animals I'd spent hours painting up, and it wasn't quite what I was wanting. So just keep that in mind. You want to pour resin in at least a room temperature area of your house. So here we go. I've let the resin set for a day, and I will peel off the dam. And it actually did a really good job. It didn't have any leakage here. The sides are pretty clear and straight. And so now all we gotta do is remove some of the excess resin at the top. You can see we have thin bits of resin there. And then we will make some waves up at the top, put some gloss coat on the sides of the resin, and we will be finished. So here I'm just taking my hobby knife, cutting along the sides of the diorama here, getting rid of that excess resin. So to create my waves, I'm going to be using Woodland Scenic's water effects, which I'm just stippling onto the diorama here with an old brush. I've used this stuff in the past, and it does a pretty good job of simulating fast-moving water, rapids, and such. And so I decided to use this instead of Mod Podge, which are good for making subtle ripples, but nothing more than that. So I'll just apply this all over the top of the model, and then I will let it sit for a few hours. And if you want to go the extra mile, on one of my models I decided there weren't very many buildings on this diorama, so I thought I might go ahead and make a large wave, tidal wave, kind of coming and crashing into the building. And so for this I'm going to be using Woodland Scenic's wave effects, which is this really nice gel material where you can actually work with it and sculpt it and make some pretty realistic looking waves. So I just glob on here with a sculpting tool a bunch of the material on the side, one side of the diorama. Then I'm going to go here with the shish kebab skewer, something with a nice point. And I'm going to use it to create kind of a barrel shape to my waves, as if a wave at this moment is coming crashing down. And that'll give a nice dynamic look to this diorama. And once those wave effects have dried, I'm now going to dry brush the waves with some pure white. And I'm just putting it on an old brush, making sure most of the paint has been wiped off on a paper towel, and just hitting the crests of the waves so make it look like some sea spray or foam as the waves are crashing around, making it look a little bit more turbulent. So I'll do that for both of my dioramas here, for the one with the more subtle waves. And then on the big wave, I'm going to keep a little bit more paint on the brush, and I'm going to go across that wave. First, I'm just going to go laterally across it to bring out any ridges on the waves, on the sides of the waves. And then I'm going to do an up and down vertical motion on the waves, right at the top of it, pulling down so that it looks like there's foam as the wave is crashing down. And then I'm just going to go across the rest of the diorama, and as before, dry brush on top of the wave effects. And in the end, it will give a nice look to these waves that we've created. And for the last step on this diorama, I'm going to take some gloss medium and cover all of the resin in that, so that it makes it a little bit more translucent. You can see through it a little bit better. And it also puts some shine onto the waves, make it look like light is reflecting off them when you're looking down upon it. And then we'll let that dry, and our diorama will be finished. So here is the finished product, and overall I'm very pleased with how these turned out. As far as dioramas go, they were really quick and painless. I think these would be a great starting project if you're just getting into dioramas. The models themselves from HobbyLink, the GeoCraper line, these things are really greatly detailed. They really soak up washes, and the pigments really adhere to them well. And really the only stressful part of this build was the resin, and I think that turned out okay as well. If I was going to nitpick, I probably would have put in a little less of the blue ink so that the resin would be a little bit more translucent, because on one of the models you can't even see the little shark that I spent like an hour painting. But again, I think these dioramas turned out really cool, and they'll be likely sitting on my desk at work. So I hope that you were able to get something from this video. If you did, please hit that like button, subscribe, and I will see you guys soon with a new video. Take care.